I struggle with Donkey Kong Country Returns. The 2010 revival of one of the most precious series of the 1990s managed to capture the hearts of avid fans without a second thought. And even as someone without much connection to the Super Nintendo games that shared the franchise name, DKC Returns was a game I absolutely committed myself to upon its release. It's what makes my surprisingly critical perspective on the game more than a decade later all the more puzzling, even in self-reflection. It's a flawed project, but it's also one that I can't help but respect, not just for what daring changes it makes, but what it represented for the series. Not since the 90s was there a time where Donkey Kong had this much of a presence in the gaming landscape, and after looking back throughout DK's catalog of games, I have a lot of trouble arguing that it was undeserved. Sure, there weren't as many creative level gimmicks in that title, but I think it was a fine way to reboot such an iconic and appreciated series, while also letting Retro Studios write their own signature on the franchise's history, one that firmly distinguished itself from their past work. By the decade's early years, they had already shown that they couldn't just make a Donkey Kong Country game, but a damn good one too. The DKC series was back, and Retro Studios had another successful series that demanded expansion and further rejuvenation. It's unfortunate then that much of the excitement of Retro's new DK outing was largely ignored. In the wake of a less than revered installment in the other series Retro revived, there was an outcry for the studio to return to that series and give it the kickstart it desperately needed. In the eyes of many fans, there was a mark of shame on the Metroid series at this point in history, and within a very challenging time for Nintendo's Wii U system, having Retro Studios helm the series again made a lot of sense to many in the community. But Retro Studios had other priorities. In a world where the clamor for a new Metroid Prime game was tough to overlook, there was skepticism in whether a new Donkey Kong Country game was the way to go for Retro. Now, hindsight's 20/20, but if Retro did return to the Metroid series and focused on a new title for the Wii U, I don't think Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze would have made the splash it deserved to. And that's a bit upsetting, because thinking about a gaming world without Tropical Freeze is not something I'm down with. This game isn't just a challenging, stylish platformer. This is one of Retro Studios' crowning achievements, a masterful evolution of the budding proficiencies that the dev house demonstrated on the Wii back in 2010. It's Donkey Kong Country for a new age, frequently matching its SNES counterparts, and in some ways, surpassing them just as effortlessly. Tropical Freeze gets going in a pretty endearing way, with DK, Dixie, Diddy, and Cranky about to dig into some banana cake for DK's birthday. Of course, things get cut short as we're introduced to the Snowmad tribe, a collective of new enemies that invade DK Island and blanket it in freezing snow. The attack leaves DK and the other Kongs not just interrupted, but blown straight off the island. With the Snowmads in total control of DK's turf, the Kongs must fight back the Snowmad influence across several other islands, making their way back home to take on the tribe and their mysterious leader. While the Snowmads do have similarities to another crew of enemies from Donkey Kong history, they are, without a doubt, more interesting than the Tiki Tak tribe from DKC Returns. While the most obvious upgrade is their more expressive designs, they also appear more organized in many cases. The Snowmads prove to be an industrious bunch, far more captivating in their actions than their DKC Returns predecessors. The easy-to-identify snowflake icon also gives them a persistent sense of place in DK's world, as it shows how their influence has captured the other islands that DK and his friends explore. These guys have absolutely proven their strength, and seeing DK steadily win back each island from Snowmad control is incredibly satisfying, especially as their machinations become more intricate and their influence more concrete. It's a nice little narrative direction that makes them interesting, compelling, and feel like an even greater threat. By expanding the world beyond DK Island alone, Retro Studios do afford themselves more open range of presentation options. While the more approachable graphical style introduced in DKC Returns is still in play, Tropical Freeze reaches for aesthetics that feel untapped and foreign for the series' established moods. The second island, Autumn Heights, explores the vibe of Swiss mountainsides, with its giant windmills, pine tree backgrounds, and elf horns played by the owl enemies. But it never stands still. Between riding through a giant sawmill track and Sawmill Thrill to leaping across balloon-lifted platforms in Alpine Incline, Autumn Heights makes a startling impression of varied but still cohesive stage presentations. Island 5, Juicy Jungle, goes even further by silently explaining the result of the Snowmad's conquest, where they harvest the island's giant fruit, process it into juice or jelly, then freeze it into popsicles for the boss of the island to savor. I do wish more of the islands had this level of narrative flow, but Juicy Jungle is still a fantastic example of using these foreign aesthetics creatively. When you make it back to DK Island to take back the Kong's home, you even see some familiar faces from DKC Returns in the background, like Crowded Cavern's Giant Bat and Handy Hazard's Machine Eye. Very nice touches to make the whole world feel chronologically consistent. It was clear that Retro Studios had a ton of ideas for Donkey Kong Country post-Returns development, but these ideas were by no means leftover scraps. Tropical Freeze uses these expanded boundaries to power its aesthetics so well, reaching for new vibes and giving them the consideration needed to flourish. The music also benefits from this expansion, as acclaimed DK maestro David Wise returns as the primary composer for Tropical Freeze. It's great to see such an iconic figure in game music make such a high-profile appearance, especially in a series he's been so tightly connected to. And with Kenji Yamamoto still having oversight over audio production within his own team, the music feels so much more diverse than anything seen in DKC Returns. So many original tracks evoke new vibes that feel separate from the established tones of DK's world. I adore the folk-inspired strings and harmonica of Windmill Hill's theme, a serene, peaceful tune that makes the second island, Autumn Heights, once again, a foreign but inviting world to explore. Island 3, Bright Savannah, heavily evokes the majestic landscape of Africa, and no better example is its opener, Grassland Groove, whose theme has plenty of energetic, propulsive percussion and rhythmic vocal chants. But few tracks reach the choked-up elegance of Seashore War on DK Island, whose shimmering background instrumentation, waltzing drum rhythms, and pristine guitar melodies are some of the best that Wise has put to note. This track is a breathtaking performance, right up there with Aquatic Ambience or In a Snowbound Land, as some of Wise's most atmospheric and beautiful compositions. So many of these themes daringly separate themselves from much of what DK and his friends have experienced thus far, creatively capitalizing on the scope of these new islands and what the devs can accomplish with them in mind. There are several new arrangements of existing tracks as well, but the spins that the audio team puts on many of them are absolutely incredible. World 4's Irate 8 has a transition from a rearranged aquatic ambience to the eerie electronic beat of Lockjaw's Saga, feeling almost seamless in how it carries the mood of a looming threat, an easy highlight for the game's OST. The soundtrack of DKC Tropical Freeze manages to hold its own as a strong, engaging OST in DK's catalog, one that, even when throwing things back, sounds forward-thinking in ways that DK just hasn't experienced in a long time. In all honesty, this drive to make the worlds of Tropical Freeze feel foreign is not anything new to the Donkey Kong franchise. It's the most logical comparison you can think of, but Tropical Freeze really does feel like Retro's Donkey Kong Country 2. Like in DKC 2, the heroes are on unfamiliar ground, leaving their home island behind to take on a bigger threat with higher stakes to match. Rescuing DK from the Kremlings was DKC 2's major motivation, a great one in fact, one that also made Diddy and Dixie's own initiative all the more imposing, and all the more rewarding when the big guy is freed. Tropical Freeze's higher stakes lie in taking on an army of Snowmads, an organized battalion that's already conquered many other islands before reaching DK's. They prove to be a stronger, more accomplished threat than even the Kremlings, which, considering how technologically advanced K. Rool and crew are, is pretty damn impressive. Tropical Freeze does do a lot to stack the odds against DK and his friends, blowing them far from DK Island while leaving their home under strict enemy control. But like DKC 2, it places the heroes in a journey that doesn't feel insurmountable. Even when put up against a stronger enemy, DK and friends are still willing to have some fun along the way, shown in the characters' enthusiastic animations and cartoony pummelings at the end of the boss fights against the Snowmad generals. The narrative and contextual parallels between DKC 2 and Tropical Freeze are clear. In the spirit of sequels, the entire journey is bigger and bolder than before. And in that spirit, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze makes a gutsy claim for itself. While it sounds like a no-brainer that a sequel to a prolific series reboot would get things moving quickly, this outing does echo many of the gameplay sensibilities that Donkey Kong Country 2 did as well. It's a project that, while rarely straying from the established mechanical templates set in place by its predecessor, is always reaching for more. It's safe to say that Tropical Freeze expects the player to have already experienced the previous Donkey Kong Country before. That being said, DKC Returns had the uphill battle to grab both established DKC fans from the 90s and newcomers to Nintendo's Blue Ocean, brought about with the Wii system. It was a steady balancing act that took a careful hand to make work. Tropical Freeze takes less convincing in that sense. With the nuts and bolts already in place once again, this sequel doesn't need to do that much different to grab the attention of established fans. The expectations fuel that gutsy claim that if you're playing DKC Tropical Freeze, this isn't your first rodeo. Nowhere is this clearer than in World 1-1. Mangrove Cove manages to introduce a ton of gameplay elements over the course of its runtime. DKC's returning abilities like rolling and tossing barrels are shown loud and clear, but so are using barrel cannons, finding puzzle piece items, chasing winged bananas for secrets, and even using environmental gimmicks for additional bonuses. It hurls a ton of mechanics at the player, expecting them to pick up on at least some of them before the level's conclusion, in a way that encourages replays, compelling the player to revisit once they're a bit more skilled and insightful toward the game's design. But I'd also argue that someone who has already played DKC Returns probably won't skip a beat in nabbing puzzle pieces or finding secrets, even on their first run. Once again, this is a strong assumption about who would likely be playing DKC Tropical Freeze in the first place, but I do think it pays off. The new plucking mechanic that lets DK grab items and pull them out of the ground is also introduced in Mangrove Cove. While it sounds like an extraneous inclusion, it's a great substitute for the poorly implemented blowing mechanic from Returns. DK demonstrating his enormous strength is a much better representation of his character, and even better, the plucking does more than simply pull up items from beneath the earth. Some pullable handles affect the environment, like activating platforms or generating transitions to other areas of the stage. I wouldn't say the plucking satisfies the game's movement mechanics, however, which can be a pacebreaker toward the kinetic gameplay. Also, the handles are simpler to read than the blowing mechanics in Returns, which at least required a bit of deduction of when it had to be used. Handles stand out relatively easily in the levels compared to dandelions or candles for blowing. Still, I'd be lying if I said the plucking mechanic wasn't an improvement to DK's moveset, and in Tropical Freeze's case, it keeps things introspective, which was a major goal in the DKC design book. Despite this surprisingly high amount of mechanics introduced in Level 1-1, the following levels of Lost Mangroves introduce other concepts more steadily, one major one being the new Kong companions. In Returns, Diddy Kong was all you had. His rocket barrel jetpack gave you extra airtime in a pinch, along with extra health. But in Tropical Freeze, Dixie Kong and Cranky Kong joined the party as well. Dixie's iconic ponytail gives DK a bit of lift, but depending on how she's used, she can also provide a bit of hover too. Cranky, on the other hand, uses his cane to bounce on surfaces, which when combined with DK's roll can lead to enormous horizontal movement. He can also do additional damage to enemies and can even bounce off spiked surfaces. So you have 3 Kongs to back DK up in the levels, but once again, these are essentially power-ups, so stages need to compensate for DK alone most of the time. However, Tropical Freeze does incentivize having one of the other Kongs in tow to grab extra bonuses and secret exits, such as using Dixie's ponytail spin underwater to propel DK past barriers. I like this decision, as little as it's used, because it encourages skilled play to retain the companions and keep them in tow. It's a cool direction that gives the companions more purpose and importance than before. But it becomes clear that some Kongs are more helpful than others. I won't beat around the bush. Dixie is the best companion in Tropical Freeze, hands down. Her ponytail twirl's upward lift is already a huge plus over Diddy or Cranky, but the ability to slightly hover makes Diddy's movement practically redundant in practice. There's almost nothing Diddy does that Dixie can't do, and more often better. Cranky manages to have more situations where his protection from spikes can lead to secret exits, but his cane needs something to bounce off of to gain that extra height or distance. That doesn't have much utility in the many levels with bottomless pits, as Cranky becomes a fun, but ultimately situational companion compared to Dixie or even Diddy. DKC Returns' readable design definitely made things easier to navigate, but it made for stages that rarely surprised, focusing more on aesthetic diversity than fresh gameplay twists that required reevaluation of the player's moveset. Tropical Freeze does make a stronger effort to keep players on their toes, and throws curveballs more frequently than Returns did. The water fruits of Scorch and Torch are simple, but nice ways to encourage creative thinking, allowing DK to extinguish brush fires in the stage that might impede progress. Panicky Paddle's platforms flip as fruit flies about the screen, which can be a real challenge if your timing isn't on point. Horntop Hop is one of the best examples, as falling leaf platforms and the owls blowing into the elf horns gel with the musical theme itself to make a layered stage that surprises with every step. The game doesn't push the gimmicks quite as far as I would like, though. More of the really memorable bits come from aesthetic twists on existing obstacles, or simply more challenging arrangements of hazards, but I'd be lying if I said that Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze runs in place when it comes to providing surprising stage design. It's not quite on the level as its SNES counterparts, but it's certainly an improvement. Now, if you recall my DKC Returns video, I made a point that Retro Studios had taken the Donkey Kong Country franchise and put their own spin on it, mostly in part to their energetic and dynamic level design. They made challenges of volatility, constantly keeping everything from stage elements to background presentation pieces in motion. That was Retro Studios' strongest contribution to this series, and what made DKC Returns such a standout work for their portfolio and the series they continued. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze takes that design concept and multiplies it tenfold. It's an incredible example of how levels can move and progress, even during moments where there are no set pieces or challenges to speak of. The best way I can describe Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is that it's a living game. Really, it's a fine idea to use spectacle in your games, things that focus more on the thrill of the scene instead of giving the player total control over what's going on. I don't mind this, because let's face it, that stuff looks cool. But there's something to be said of when this spectacle contributes to how a game actually plays. Sweeping camera transitions to challenge players' perspectives, moving components of stage layouts to internalize how they function, seeing a world in an active state and understanding what each part does to serve that state. These are all pieces of dynamic level design. They make levels feel like they're moving in real time, that they aren't just arbitrary stationary objects that the player must jump or roll over. Dynamic level design like this is a way for a world to feel alive, like the physical rules are making the parts of the levels move like anything would in reality. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is Retro Studios in a seemingly effortless gesture, making levels feel alive. There's a context, a sense of place that every obstacle seems to have as DK and friends press onward through the stages. They move like pieces of a giant machine, but displayed in a natural, logical form, one that allows the devs to twist and contort expectations while also deriving challenge from those level layouts. It's hard to envision at first, but once you see the stages in DKC Tropical Freeze in action, it's clear that this kind of design simply couldn't work for any older DKC game. One apparent example of this is the sweeping dynamic camera. By allowing more compelling angles for the camera to view, Tropical Freeze doesn't just ooze spectacle, but it also lets the game design feel so much bigger. Trunk Twister is an early minecart stage, which moves from a standard side view to a slightly angled view of the track, as it twirls around the giant tree. The level itself remains easy to read when dodging obstacles, but with this continuous camera shot, the scope of the level is amplified enormously. Gone are the lone side profile shots of the SNES days. Now we're seeing larger-than-life levels shown with more creative visual direction, but without making it player hostile. The camera is also used to show massive scene transitions in barrel cannon sections, as Canopy Chaos has DK ricochet around girders to move from one part of the level to the next. Similarly, it broadens the scope of the stage itself, letting DK move to higher or more distant areas easily, but without breaking immersion with camera cuts that could potentially disorient. Sure, the game doesn't totally abandon these transitions, the underwater stages certainly have their share, but more often than not, stages feel enormous and spacious, though not to the point of impracticality. It's an admittedly simple trick, but it's one that clearly shows what Donkey Kong Country can do under more powerful hardware. As in Returns, the auto-scrollers continue to be absolutely incredible examples of making scripted stages into constantly moving clockwork machines. Sawmill Thrill is a minecart stage that has a giant buzzsaw chipping away at the track, tossing blocks and debris in DK's way, so he must either jump over or even ride atop the pieces. Reckless Ride's rocket barrel is under constant attack by a snowmad enemy piloting an automaton to take DK out, acting more like a boss fight than a traditional side-scroller. It's no surprise that Retro Studios would further refine what were already some of the most impressive parts of their past DK adventure, but I did not expect them to push things this far. So many moments in these sections left me with my jaw on the floor, absolutely in shock over the levels of spectacle implemented in the stages. But don't think this kind of spectacle was hollow eye candy. The scripted nature of the auto-scrollers put just the right amount of limitations on stage, giving the devs the honed focus needed to really map out the level in the most compelling and surprising ways. While DKC Returns definitely showed the devs' skill at crafting scripted level design that felt like so much more, Tropical Freeze is the creative apex of that direction. No game I've ever played has made me this excited for an auto-scrolling stage. And once again, like in Returns, Tropical Freeze keeps this initiative toward dynamic stage design well beyond the traditional minecart and rocket barrel stages. Each piece of the levels is rich with a reality-driven sense of place, something that Retro clearly wanted to expand upon, and desperately. Beehive Brawl has giant beehives covered in vines for DK to grab onto, but even wilder is how they're precariously suspended in the air by sticky honey. It's so tense, feeling like one wrong move could have the beehives detach from the honey entirely, and sometimes that's totally the case. Irate 8 has the octopus from Return's Stormy Shore make a reappearance, this time reaching its tentacles around the underwater sections on the fly, creating active obstacles throughout the stage and culminating in an exciting chase at the stage's end. But few stages present this design mentality better than the aforementioned Grassland Groove. The music in this stage is already a total joy, but the way so much of the level moves with the beat of its theme is absolutely infectious. It goes even further with its climbable animal puppetry, which actually kind of reminds me of the Broadway production of The Lion King. I love this level. It's such a creative concept that feels fresh and unique, even this far into the series' lifespan, and I'd argue that it's one of the greatest Donkey Kong Country levels of all time. These kinds of stages are not the exception to the rule. Tropical Freeze is filled to the brim with so many fascinating gameplay directions, constantly keeping its world in motion. Everything feels so alive in this game, and interestingly enough, not all in the same way. The dynamic chases and auto-scrollers show Retro Studios rising with a sense of controlled chaos. Pandemonium of riding mid-air planks of wood hurled from a giant buzzsaw blade is some kind of monster. But even those moments of peacefulness manage to flourish with aspects that feel completely plausible, like they very well could exist in reality. Even something as simple as snow gently falling from the sky in Forest Folly, or light shimmering through the ocean waters in Current Capers. The world of DK has never operated under these types of conditions before. They give the world breadth, scope, and above all else, a sense of unmatched liveliness. Nothing compares. There are things in Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze that I do wish were improved. The bad habits of repetitive bonus rooms and underutilized animal buddies do rear their ugly heads. The unlockable secret seclusion stages, while challenging and inventive in their structure, do feel like brief epilogues instead of celebratory capstones to the journey. The character perks of the Kong Pow move exacerbate the lack of balance between the companions. Hell, I'd even say Funky mode is a disappointment, as Funky's moveset is just too damn good. With fast and exciting mobility along with protection from many hazards, it's kind of tough to go back to DK and team after playing as Funky. But these issues are mere distractions to what's an otherwise incredible achievement for Retro Studios. It mindfully and daringly pushes how lively a platformer can be presented, while still providing a polished and intense collection of levels that challenge and engage in so many ways. It's such a successful work from an already proven group of developers, and one that I could recommend to practically anybody. Now, a year or so ago, I mentioned that Donkey Kong never escaped Rare, that the entire brand was defined by the Donkey Kong Country games and the skilled minds that crafted them. Rare's mark was irremovable. Whatever Donkey Kong game that would be released after their departure from the series would inevitably be compared to those Super Nintendo games. You can't really see Donkey Kong without that country. But what we're seeing now is basically the same situation, but from the opposite side. Retro Studios, a development house that has done so much for the Donkey Kong Country name, a collective of creators who had the utmost skill in making Donkey Kong into something truly spectacular. They will always have their fame integrated into the other Nintendo series they revitalized. Retro Studios, even in 2023, will be popularly known as the studio that made Metroid Prime, and not the studio that made Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. And that kind of sucks. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is so deserving of its praise. It roars with creativity, battle cries with energy, and shows what side-scrolling platformer design can be in the 2010s and beyond. No disrespect to Metroid Prime, that's one of my favorite games of all time. One that I could play over and over and enjoy every second of it. But Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze doesn't get that kind of glowing connection to Retro's history, whether it's because of the more family-friendly image or simply the stigma of being just a side-scrolling platformer. Tropical Freeze, for all its unrivaled proficiencies, has always felt like second fiddle to the trilogy that originally put Retro Studios on the map. I'm hoping this video makes the case for how bad that idea is. This is platformer designed for the ages, a startling evolution of the genre that took years of hard work from a studio that continues to impress. Whether or not this is truly the peak of Donkey Kong Country, whether or not it surpasses the standards set by even the legendary SNES trilogy, I can firmly say that Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is alive, a constantly moving machine, and a game that can stand on its own as one of Retro's all-time best. At the time of this recording, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is the last mainline DK game to be released. It's tough to believe that one of Nintendo's most iconic franchises, one that shaped the company's image in the 1990s, now has a future rich with uncertainty. I don't think Nintendo would actively abandon the Donkey Kong series, and DK has endured plenty of dry spells before. But with Retro Studios now involved with the Metroid series again, Donkey Kong has quietly stood in the background, anxiously waiting for someone to take the reins once more. The heroic ape has gone through plenty of changes over the decades, dabbling in everything from introspective side-scrolling, to exploratory collectathons, to high-intensity score attack, to spectacle-rich platforming. But now, more than ever, it's tough to see where DK will go next. And in a way, that's one of the guy's strengths. The persistent metamorphosis of the character's mechanical and design identity has been so fascinating to analyze. It's one reason why I've enjoyed talking about this series so much. There's a ton to discuss and speculate. But we have reached a turning point in this Donkey Kong month endeavor I pushed for so many years. Until a new DK game is announced, we're all caught up on the key games that made this guy such a cultural icon for video gaming as a whole. At the moment, we're at the end of the road. But who am I kidding? As any fan of the series knows, DK doesn't die easily. I've mentioned it before, but the reason that I began making Donkey Kong content was because I was inspired by many different talented creators. People who were eager to express their passion toward this series, whether it's the characters, narrative, design, mechanics, whatever cool thing they can find in any of the Donkey Kong games. These outlets made it clear that the Donkey Kong series was well worth talking about, and I wanted to be a part of that. Many of these people became creative sparks toward my own work, or even close and treasured friends. Even in periods of inactivity for the franchise, discussions surrounding Donkey Kong has flourished and persisted, proving not just the lasting legacy of the series, but the spirit and dedication of its fans. It seems fitting that I'd end a video talking about the most lively Donkey Kong game I played by directly referring to its dedicated fan base. One that's endured the radio silence and continues to bring their own excitement and life to this series. That's passion if I ever saw it. The kind that brings love and adoration to a series that's so deserving of it all. So yeah, there are a lot of red balloons floating about. DK Month has plenty of life left. Until next year.